Rain divided the night like shards of glass, splintering against the windshield as the truck crawled along the dirt road. The tires waded through mud, thick as grief, the engine humming in stubborn defiance. Inside, Clara gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. The wipers fought the storm but couldn't keep up. Water blurred the world into streaks of silver and black. Her eyes, hollow from nights without sleep, stayed fixed on the vague, endless road ahead. Every turn seemed to lead deeper into nowhere. Lightning exploded across the horizon, and for a heartbeat the world became a photo negative. White light, black sky, a single rusted sign waiting in the dark. Forsyth Ranch, do not enter. That was her destination. The cursed place. The only place left to go. Lightning sliced open the horizon, revealing the faint outline of a rusting sign half swallowed by weeds. Forsyth Ranch, do not enter. The words looked hand-painted over older letters as if trying to cover something it couldn't erase. Wind rattled the sign, metal moaning on its hinge before the dark swallowed it again. She pressed the brakes. The truck shuddered, then quieted, the engine's last growl fading beneath the storm's roar. For a moment, she just sat there, listening. Rain struck the roof in uneven rhythm, 1,000 tiny hands demanding that she stop. The storm smelled of iron and earth. Her breath trembled against the glass, ghosting her reflection, a pale, rain-lit stranger staring back. She looked older than 30, grief having carved faint valleys along her cheeks. But there was something unbroken in that stare, a quiet resolve forged in loss. Clara pushed the door open, and wind tore the handle from her grip. Cold knifed through her coat, slicing to the bone. She stepped into the mud. It swallowed her boots with a slow, sucking sound. Each step toward the gate felt heavier, as though the land itself resisted her presence. She dragged her duffel from the passenger seat, the weight familiar, yet meaningless. A handful of things from a life now gone. Lightning again. For an instant the ranch came into view beyond the gate. Skeletal fences, a sagging barn leaning into shadows, the suggestion of distant hills cut in half by mist. It wasn't a home. It was a wound in the landscape. She inhaled sharply, tasting metal and rain, then reached for the padlock on the gate. Her fingers trembled, not from cold, but memory. The key scraped once before sliding home. Thunder followed, rolling slow and low across the fields. She looked beyond the gate, into the night where her headlights dared not reach. "It's mine now," she whispered. The words vanished in the storm, too small to change anything, yet somehow enough to anchor her there. The lock clicked open. The gate groaned, a long, aching sound, as if waking from years of silence. She drove through and left the gate swinging behind her. The road narrowed, climbing slightly. The ranch appeared and disappeared in flashes of lightning, its roof caved in one corner, windows empty like blind eyes. Yet beneath the ruins stretched something alive, the faint shape of pasture, wild and untamed. She stopped the truck before the barn and killed the engine. Instantly, the world contracted into the drum of rain on metal and the low whistle of wind through old wood. Silence leaned in. Then it came, distant but piercing. A horse's cry carried through the rain, half echo, half plea. It cut through the night, clean as a blade, startling even the thunder. Clara froze. She couldn't see anything, only feel the sound filling the emptiness around her. Somewhere out there, another soul was awake, fighting for breath in the same storm. Her shoulders sagged, equal parts fear and strange recognition. She turned her face upward, letting rain wash down her cheeks until she couldn't tell tears from water. The cry sounded again, fading into the hills. She didn't know yet. That sound would save her. Morning broke pale and tired, the color of old linen. The storm had passed, leaving a silence that felt too sharp, too clean. Clara stood on the porch of the dilapidated house, boots slick with mud, watching sunlight drift across the soaked grass. Steam rose from the roofs, and for the first time in what felt like centuries, she allowed herself to breathe. The land was broken, yes, but not dead. And somewhere behind her eyes, distant as an echo, the city she'd fled began to surface. Once, her mornings had smelled of coffee and antiseptic. The clinic had been a heartbeat of life, dogs barking, the quiet hum of machines, her laughter tangled with her brothers as they worked side by side. He was younger by 6 years, reckless and brilliant. He believed in her without reason. That belief used to give her strength. Now it only gave her pain. It had happened on a Tuesday, ordinary except for the sound that never left her dreams. The crash of metal, the flash of frightened movement, the sharp cry of an animal and human colliding in one terrible instant. Her brother had been in the wrong room at the wrong time, helping her clean up after surgery. The oxygen tank had tipped. The dog panicked. The scalpel tray fell. Fate required no motive, only timing. By the time the ambulance came, her white coat was red. People said, "It wasn't your fault," as if saying it enough might make it true. The words rubbed raw against her guilt until she stopped answering calls, stopped unlocking her door. Her fiancé, Ryan, waited for months. His last message, "Come home when you can forgive yourself," went unanswered. There was no home left. Only the empty clinic in her mind, the smell of blood and anesthetic woven too tightly to memory. She sold the apartment, the car, even her medical tools, as though erasing evidence could erase the event. Then she disappeared into the digital wilderness, scrolling through property listings at 2 a.m. A thumbnail stopped her. Forsyth Ranch. 28 acres. $1,000 as is, local pickup only. The ad's comments were riddled with superstition. People spoke of shadows moving through the barn, animals dying without reason, owners fleeing overnight. She should have closed the browser. Instead, she stared at the photos, the crooked porch, the sea of yellow grass, a lone tree clawing at the horizon. Something unnamed pulled her toward it. Maybe it was punishment. Maybe it was survival. When the paperwork arrived, the realtor's message was strangely brief. No liability assumed. Keys in mailbox. Good luck. She'd laughed then, the first laugh in months, though it sounded foreign. The world had already punished her. What more could a cursed ranch do? Now, standing in the drenched morning, Clara touched the key still hanging on a string around her neck. The house behind her smelled of dust and decay, yet the air inside the walls seemed to breathe with faint possibility. She walked through the front door, each step echoing years of absence. A broken mirror leaned against the hall. Her reflection appeared in fragments, forehead, cheek, shoulder, never whole. It suited her. She opened the curtains and light spilled across the warped floor. It wasn't comfort she wanted. It was silence. Space big enough for her guilt to stretch without choking her. And maybe, just maybe, the legend of this place frightened her because it mirrored her own story, something once alive that everyone had given up on. Outside, crows circled above the barn, wings slicing the air like black ribbons. Clara watched them until they dissolved into distance. The ranch was waiting, patient as the grave, holding its breath to see whether she'd run too. She didn't. Not yet. The ranch revealed its secrets in fragments, a rust-eaten bucket half buried in the dirt, fence posts leaning like old men, wind threading through tall grass that whispered names she didn't yet know. Each day Clara explored a little farther, fixing what she could, cataloguing rot. Silence hung over everything, thick and waiting. Somewhere within it, a heartbeat pulsed, at first imagined, then unmistakably real. She followed it past the skeletal barn and down a slope where brambles clawed at her jeans. Beneath a tangle of dead vines lay a corral, its gate chained and padlocked, board splintered from kicks that spoke of rage and fear. The scent hit her before she saw him. Sweat, damp hay, the metallic sweetness of hunger. A black stallion stood motionless in the far corner, ribs like shadows beneath his skin. His eyes caught the light, dark amber flaring to gold for a fleeting instant before he turned away. The animal's beauty startled her. It was the kind that hurt to look at. Muscles coiled with tension, mane heavy and wild, scars banding his neck as if the world had tried to choke him and failed. He wasn't resting. He was waiting. Clara unlaced the chain and stepped closer, boots crunching glass and gravel. The sound made his ears twitch, his head lifted, and the air between them tightened. Something ancient shimmered there, recognition, maybe, or warning. She felt her chest constrict under its weight. "Hey," she said softly, voice carried off by wind. The stallion stamped, the thud echoing across the empty pasture. Words, her usual medicine, meant nothing here. She took another step. He charged. The motion was instant. Black motion, thunder splitting the air, hooves tearing soil. Clara froze, until instinct wrenched her backward. The gate slammed behind her as he crashed against it, the wood shuddering under his power. She fell to her knees in the dirt, heart hammering, rainwater from last night splashing cold along her wrists. The horse tossed his head, screaming through flared nostrils, the sound unreal, something between fury and grief. Local voices arrived before silence could return. 2 men from the nearest town had seen her truck and wandered over, curiosity drawn by the sound of chaos. One spat into the mud. "You found the devil then?" he muttered. "That horse'll kill you like he almost killed the last one." Clara stared through the rails. The stallion had retreated slightly, nostrils still trembling, sides heaving. He wasn't the devil. He was terrified. The older man scratched his beard. Should have let the sheriff put him down years ago after what happened. Barn burned, owner died, and that beast walked out without a mark. Cursed. Same as the land. They left with their warnings trailing behind them, boots crunching through gravel until distance reclaimed them. When silence returned, it carried a new name. Cursed. The word itched at her conscience. More superstition, she told herself, but her hands still shook. She returned to the corral fence at dusk. Shadows stretched long across the field, blurring boundaries between sky and soil. The stallion stood unmoving, eyes tracking her like a hunter, measuring distance. For a long while she simply watched him, breath even, refusing to break pace. Regret pressed at her ribs, an invisible mirror of the creature's rage. She saw herself in him, untouched not by choice, but necessity. Both punished by accidents no one could undo. The fence boards glowed faintly in the fading light. "I'm not scared of you," she whispered. The stallion's ears twitched, head tilting as though he'd understood the tremor beneath the words, rather than the words themselves. Night thickened around them until the world became sound, the flutter of insects, the sigh of wind through. Broken beams, the steady rhythm of her breathing slowly answering his. She lingered until the stars erased the line of the hills, then turned back toward the house, each step leaving a soft print in the wet earth. Sleep found her poorly. The mattress groaned under shifting dreams. In them, flames chewed through wood. Smoke choked the walls of the barn. She heard a girl screaming, hooves pounding against dirt, a man shouting a name she didn't know. The image of the stallion reared in the firelight, mane aflame, eyes bright as moons, then collapsing into darkness. She jerked awake, drenched in sweat, the scent of smoke lingering where none should be. Her pulse refused to settle. She sat up, listening to the house breathe, creaks, sighs, the occasional patter of water slipping from the roof. From outside came a faint sound, a hoof striking wood. Once, twice, pausing, then again. Not panic, not violence, communication. She rose and walked to the window. The corral was a smudge of black against black, but she could almost feel the stallion's presence, a weight in the silence. Some ghosts, she realized, don't stay buried. Some pace in circles waiting for the one fool brave enough, or broken enough, to listen. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, whispering into the dark, though she wasn't sure to whom. In the quiet that followed, even the wind seemed to stop breathing. Days unwound without any clear edge between them. Morning rain slid into afternoon fog. The ranch lived and died inside shades of grey. Clara moved through each hour as if underwater, slow and muted. She patched fence posts until her palms split, swept the barn until splinters buried beneath her nails, carried buckets of grain the stallion never touched. Labor had become her prayer, penance disguised as progress. Each morning she approached the corral, voice steady, movements measured. The stallion would watch her from the farthest corner, nostrils flaring at her scent, his body a coil of distrust. She'd leave the water filled and the hay fresh and retreat backward, never turning her back until he stopped shaking. By evening, both offerings remained untouched. At night, she'd eat crackers from a chipped plate, staring out windows veined with dust. The radio she found in a cabinet refused to play music, offering only static whispers that reminded her of voices she couldn't let go. In that grainy hum, she heard her brother calling her name, tender and accusing all at once. When the wind pushed through the rafters, it echoed the sound of him laughing, then gasping, then gone. She pressed her hands to her ears until her fingernails dug crescents into the skin. The townspeople visited rarely, each time with the same tone, curiosity disguised as concern. "You're still there?" a woman at the feed store asked when Clara came for nails. "Most don't last a season. You'll see." "That place takes something." Clara forced a smile, loaded supplies into her truck, and said nothing. It was easier to let them believe the stories than explain the truth, that she stayed not for courage, but because leaving would mean facing herself. The weeks wore her down. Mud soaked every pair of boots, wind peeled paint from doors faster than she could replace it, yet somehow she kept trying. She scattered apples along the edges of the stallion's pen, left her voice soft and low, let him smell her jacket before she retreated again. Once she thought he almost stepped toward her. Then a clap of thunder fractured the sky, and he reared, slamming his hooves against the fence so hard the sound cracked through her chest. She stumbled back, a sharp pain biting her ankle as she hit the ground. The horse stamped once more, then stilled. For a heartbeat, their eyes locked, her fear mirrored in his, and then the moment dissolved. That night, she dreamed again of the fire. The barn screaming with heat, her brother inside instead of the man from the old story. The stallion's wild shape charged through the smoke, and she woke, choking, heartbeat unraveling fast. The dawn brought drizzling rain and no relief. Everything smelled of damp ash that didn't exist. Rumors reached her quicker than hope ever could. At the diner in town, she overheard two men speaking her name. "She's next," one said. "Curse don't skip." Their laughter clanged in her ears, and she walked out before the waitress returned with her coffee. Driving home, the landscape blurred until she could no longer tell if it was fog or tears that made the world fade around its edges. That evening, the air thickened with electricity. Storm clouds assembled above the hills, swollen and dark. Birds fled in sharp, diagonal lines, their cries slicing through the wind. Clara ran outside to fasten gate latches, slipping in mud, breath fuming in the cold. The barn doors groaned but held. She checked the corral last, boards rattling, chains thrumming like guitar strings strung too tight. Then lightning struck somewhere behind the ridge, so near the earth trembled. The stallion bolted, crashing against the posts. One split clean down the center, then another. Clara reached for the rope, shouting something that vanished in the thunder's snarl. Rain flung itself sideways, the lock tore free. Wood exploded. The stallion surged through the gap like a shadow unchained. In 3 strides he was gone, just the furious flash of black muscle disappearing into the storm. Clara ran after him, feet sliding, lungs clawing at air. Every step pulled her deeper into mud that sucked at her knees. The rain blinded her. The only trace of him now was the chaos of churned earth, the echo of hooves swallowed by rolling thunder. She stopped at the edge of the field, arms outstretched as if she might catch him by sheer will. There was only wind. Something inside her cracked open. Her voice rose raw. "Everyone leaves me." It wasn't meant for the horse. It was meant for hospitals, for funerals, for the empty seat at dinner tables she would never visit again. The storm carried her cry away, shredding it before it reached the hills. She sank to her knees, mud swallowing her palms. Water streamed down her hair, mixing with salt and soil. When the thunder quieted, a smaller sound survived, the fragile stutter of her breathing. Slowly, the storm retreated, melting into a rhythmic drizzle. The corral stood torn, gates askew, chains hanging limp. The barn door banged open in the wind, the sound hollow, indifferent. In the weak light before dawn, the ranch looked stripped bare, as if all that motion had emptied it of life. Clara sat a long time in the mud, unable to move, staring at her hands. They trembled violently, each muscle twitching with exhausted rage. She could see every scar from the past weeks, every cut from rusted wire, every layer of grime that work and grief had built alike. The world hushed back into stillness. Rain slowed until each drop sounded distinct, marking seconds that stretched into infinity. She bowed her head, unable to tell whether she was praying or surrendering. The horizon lightened, the storm's last mercy. Around her, the ranch inhaled again, ruined, but alive. Yet the silence that settled there was not peace. It was absence, cold and final. Somewhere in the distance a single fence board creaked, moving gently as though caught by invisible breath. She thought she'd lost him, but fate had one more lesson to teach. Morning crept in uncertainly, a grey hush settling over the hills. The storm had left the world bruised, trees torn, fences drowned beneath small rivers of mud. Clara hadn't slept. She moved through the wreckage like a ghost, sleeves heavy with rainwater, hair matted into ropes. The corral yawned open before her, its splintered gates swinging aimless in the wind. There were no hoofprints left. The rain had wiped them clean, erasing what little proof of his existence she'd had. Her body ached from the cold, but it was the emptiness that hurt most, the silence after the storm, the kind that makes a person hear their own heartbeat. She walked toward the creek that wound behind the pastures, following the sound of moving water. The rain had swollen it into a restless torrent, carrying branches, leaves, and odd remnants from the ranch's wreckage. Something caught her eye, a flash of soaked leather spinning in the current before snagging on a rock. She waded in without thinking. The water bit through her jeans, numbing her legs as she pulled free a broken saddle, the leather scarred by flames and years. A brass nameplate clung stubbornly to one strap. R. Forsyth. The name of the last owner. She dragged the saddle onto the bank, breathing hard, then noticed something else wedged beneath it, a small book swollen by water. Its pages fused together like skin healing wrong. She carried both back to the porch, where the weak light allowed her to see the faint ghost of handwriting bleeding through the paper. With delicate fingers, she pried pages apart, spreading them flat. The ink had blurred, yet parts of sentences remained. The horse
pulled her clear. Fire took everything.
And later, he saved my child.
But they won't believe.
Blame him, Clara read until the words disintegrated into stains.
Images unfolded, not curses, but tragedy. A barn ablaze, a desperate man cutting through smoke.
The stallion breaking free of a stall to drag a small girl by her collar through a gap, hooves burning, lungs seared with heat. The owner, R. Forsyth, had gone back inside to retrieve something else and never returned. Grief had turned that moment into myth, transforming salvation into damnation because truth was too heavy to bear. The realization hit her with physical force. Her breath left in a sharp, painful gasp. The stallion hadn't been the monster they feared. He'd been the witness. Behind the scars lay loyalty, bravery, confusion. He'd carried someone's memory of guilt, just as she carried her own. Two creatures condemned by misunderstanding. She let the journal fall into her lap and stared across the wet fields. The sun still hadn't broken the clouds, and maybe that was mercy. She could feel thunder building again far away, rolling under the horizon like a restless promise. Her reflection in the window caught her eye, face pale and smudged with dirt. For the first time she could look at herself without flinching. She understood now the curse wasn't the land or the horse. It was the human heart, twisting loss into punishment. Her brother's death hadn't been hers to carry alone, just as the stallion wasn't the villain of Forsyth's story. They had both been pieces of other people's pain that no one tried to understand. Her fingers brushed the brass nameplate again before she slipped it into her pocket. The gesture felt like closing a circle. Then she stood, shouldering her coat and stepping into the gathering drizzle. The air smelled of wet cedar and the faint sweetness of clover awakened by rain. As she walked beyond the porch, the weight of hesitation dropped somewhere behind her boots. A single line of fence ran along the hill's edge, pointing toward the wilderness that had swallowed him. She followed it. Mud pulled at her steps. Water beaded on her eyelashes, and still she went on. The valley narrowed into a trail where prints of hooves, just barely visible, mottled the softer earth. She crouched, tracing one with her hand.
"You're still out there," she murmured, voice trembling.
"You didn't deserve their fear." She climbed, knees shaking, lungs burning, until the creek appeared beside her again, looping higher into the hills. Trees bent with the wind, dropping silver leaves into the current. The sky grew darker, clouds stretching long and low, like bruises across the horizon. Thunder murmured again. Clara paused on a ridge where the land opened wide, the ranch far below like an old photograph fading at its edges. She pulled the broken saddle from where she'd slung it over her shoulder and placed it gently on the ground, facing east. Her jacket clung to her skin, hair plastered to her face, yet she smiled through rain that tasted almost new. "He deserves peace as much as I do," she whispered. The words rang simple but sacred, the first honest prayer she had spoken in years. Lightning bled across the far hills, painting the sky white for an instant. She didn't flinch. Somewhere beyond that light was the stallion, running, hiding, surviving despite everyone. She closed her eyes and saw him not as he'd been.
Angry, starving, but as he might be again.
Muscles stretching into freedom. Scars hidden beneath rain-polished skin. The sound of thunder folded over her once more, louder now, closer. She stood firm, letting the storm wrap itself around her like an old friend finally acknowledged. It was no longer punishment. It was invitation. Down below, the creek hissed through the stones. The saddle, soaked and blackened, gleamed faintly with reflected light, as if thanking her for being found. She turned from it and began walking toward the dark horizon, driven by something purer than guilt, a quiet promise to find the creature who, without knowing, had carried her reflection all along. What happened next would change everything. The climb stole the warmth from her body, but she didn't stop. The sky had deepened into slate, clouds stitched with restless light far above the ridges. Hours had blurred into a trembling rhythm of breath, thunder, and heartbeat. Clara followed the narrow path where the creek curved and climbed, weaving through scrub and rock, each gust of wind cutting her with rain that felt almost solid. Then she heard it, a sound she knew before her mind had time to name it, a crash of movement followed by a cry, cracked with pain. The stallion's voice, she ran.
Mud and stones slid beneath her boots.
Branches whipped her face, drawing blood she didn't notice. At the edge of a clearing she saw him. He lay tangled in a snare of barbed wire stretched between two charred posts, half hidden by fallen brush. His chest rose in shallow bursts, flanks slicked with blood where the metal had bitten deep. One hind leg twitched weakly, eyes rolling toward her in panic. For a heartbeat she froze, every instinct screamed to keep distance. Then fear folded beneath something sharper. She dropped her pack, tore off her coat, and moved toward him, voice steady though her lungs burned.
"It's okay," she whispered.
The wind tore half the words away. Each step was deliberate. She unwrapped her scarf, held it where he could see, then knelt beside his head. The barbs sliced her palms as she worked, cutting wire with the pocket knife from her belt. The smell of blood and rain mixed into one metallic haze. The stallion jerked when metal snapped, but she didn't stop. She kept speaking gently, broken words, fragments more feeling than language. When the last strand fell, he didn't bolt. He simply dropped his head in the grass, breath rattling like dry paper. Clara pressed her palm to his neck. Beneath the scars, she could feel the pulse, faint, uneven, but alive. She stayed there until night grew enormous around them, until the thunder's rage dimmed into drizzle and the world remembered silence. She wrapped her coat over his shoulders and whispered, not apologies, not prayers, but forgiveness. For him, for her brother, for every day she'd spent running from ghosts that never learned to rest. The stallion's breathing steadied. His eyes, hollow with exhaustion, found hers once before closing. When dawn came, it was gentle. Pale gold bled across the horizon, smoothing the sharp edges of stone and storm. Mist rose from the ground, coiling around them like smoke that refused to burn. Clara's body ached, fingers raw and swollen, but she felt cleaner than she had since the day everything broke. Driven by instinct shared between wounded creatures, the stallion shifted, pushing against the earth. She helped him stand, steadying his trembling weight. When he finally lifted his head to the sun, a soft sound escaped her, half sob, half laughter. "You made it," she murmured, and he responded with a low snort that sounded almost grateful. She named him Valor before noon. It was a word neither of them had earned easily. What followed blurred into seasons, stitched together by work and stillness. A new barn rose from the skeleton of the old one, planks hewed by her own hands. With each nail driven, she buried a piece of her past. The house filled again with the smell of hay, oats, and the faint sweetness of life returning. Valor healed slowly, scar tissue thickened, but his eyes softened. He began to follow her voice. He learned trust by inches. Summer brought children, small knots of restless energy from the outreach program. A neighbor convinced her to try. Troubled youth, they called them. Clara saw instead reflections. Wild, eyes, unspoken fear, the same hunger for acceptance she saw in Valor when he'd first turned toward her. She taught them how to feed gently, how to wait through silence without forcing it. Some had never touched an animal before. The first time a boy laughed as Valor nudged an apple from his hand, Clara felt something uncoil inside her rib cage, a warmth she could barely name. Days lengthened. The ranch shifted from hushed ruin to quiet rhythm, hammering, footsteps, the distant hum of young voices. Mirrors filled not with ghosts, but with dust motes dancing in new light. Clara's hands grew rougher, steadier. The tremor that once haunted her touch vanished. Autumn rolled through golden and kind. Leaves drifted across the pasture, while Valor ran beneath them, hooves drumming soft thunder. The children cheered from the fence, their voices bright against the growing dusk. She watched from the hill, arms folded, the wind tugging strands of hair across her face. No walls stood between them now, neither wood nor fear. She thought of her brother then, of the clinic's sterile white, the sharp smell of antiseptic. For the first time, the memory didn't slice. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeat rediscovered. She imagined he'd like this place, the space, the quiet creatures learning to trust again. One evening, she found Valor standing by the creek where she'd first seen the broken saddle. Water shimmered around his hooves. The setting sun turned his scars to gold. He lifted his head slowly, ears flicking toward her. No trace of terror remained, only the calm gaze of something that had survived. Clara stepped beside him, lowering a hand to his flank. "You saved her once," she whispered, thinking of the girl from the journal of all the unseen rescues buried by time. "And somehow you saved me too." He breathed out warm air into her palm, a soft assurance that needed no words. As the sun sank and the sky flushed crimson, Valor broke into a run. Free, unchained, muscles rolling beneath healing skin, mane flaring like liquid fire. Clara watched until he was only movement, and then just dust glowing in the last light. She smiled, slow and radiant, the kind of smile that remembered sorrow without belonging to it. Sometimes the soul you save isn't the one you expected. Morning unspooled quietly, gentle light pooling across the pasture. Mist clung to the grass, turning every blade silver until the sun warmed it away. Clara carried a bucket of feed toward the fence line, her boots leaving dark prints in dew. Valor followed beside her without a halter, steps unhurried, shoulder brushing hers the way sunlight brushes water. She could feel his calm through the air, a wordless rhythm, steady and sure. The ranch breathed differently now. Timber gleamed, where rot once hid, and laughter from the youth house on the hill drifted faintly downhill, soft as wind between reeds. Years ago, these sounds would have frightened her, proof of motion she wasn't ready for. Now they kept her steady, anchors to a life she hadn't dared imagine. She scooped feed into the trough, watching Valor bow his head, the slow grind of grain between his teeth. The orange glow caught the curve of his neck, made his scars shimmer like threads of copper. He lifted his head and nuzzled her shoulder before lowering it again. Even after all this time, the gesture surprised her. Trust, she'd learned, never arrived with thunder. It crept in with small miracles. The narrator inside her thoughts spoke softly, as if reluctant to disturb the quiet. People say kindness can't change fate, but sometimes it rewrites the story entirely. Clara walked toward the barn, sunlight spreading behind her like a tide. Inside, the walls smelled of hay and cedar oil. Tools hung in neat rows, hammer, rasp, brush, each handle worn smooth by use. She opened a small wooden box tucked on a shelf, its hinges squealing faintly, and breathed in the scent of oil and dust. Her brother's initials were carved into the lid, crooked from the impatience of youth. It had followed her all this time, moved from closet to closet, never opened until now. Inside were fragments of another life, a faded photo from their clinic, days, 2 laughing faces framed in white coats. His old watch stopped at the hour she never forgot. A folded page from the notebook he once kept, its words smudged but legible. Keep helping, no matter how it hurts. She ran a thumb across the ink until the letters blurred together. For a long moment she simply stood there, weight balanced between grief and gratitude. Forgiveness, she realized, was never a single act. It was the gentle insistence to keep breathing when you could have stayed buried. She placed the photograph on the barn wall beside the feed door. The smile looking back at her was young, fearless, unmarked by tragedy. The space around it filled with gold as morning climbed higher through the rafters. Outside, youth voices lifted in greeting. Somewhere a dog barked, sharp and joyful. She stepped back into the light, closing the toolbox with careful hands. A soft wind stirred the hay. The photograph fluttered once and settled. The ranch stretched before her, fields mending in green, patches where weeds had ruled, fences straight again, barns painted the color of old honey. What was once called cursed now thrummed with the labor of redemption, rescued horses grazing, children learning patience, people finding refuge from their own untold losses. The land carried their weight easily, forgiving without ceremony. Clara paused to take it in. The rhythmic creak of the windmill turned above the well, pulling up clear water that glinted across the troughs. Somewhere overhead, a hawk traced slow circles. Beneath its shadow, Valor lifted his head, ears pricking to her whistle. He trotted toward her, mane rippling, eyes bright with that same unwavering trust. She rested her palm against his cheek, feeling warmth through the velvet skin. He leaned lightly into the pressure, and in that small communion, something settled, a balance neither of them had possessed before. The sun crested the hills, blinding for a moment. The world exhaled. Even the cursed can become the blessed when love chooses to stay. Evening descended softly, not with thunder this time, but with light drawn slow across the horizon. The sun folded into the hills, spilling gold, the color of forgiveness over everything it touched. The air was warm, full of hay dust and the faint sweetness of clover. From the porch, the ranch looked almost mythic, fields brushed with copper, fences straight as hymns, the barn door flung wide in welcome. Clara walked the dirt path toward the front gate, boots stirring faint spirals of dust. Each step echoed the first footsteps she'd taken here, then clumsy, trembling, uncertain. The ground beneath her had changed, but not as much as she had. The ache that once guided her like a compass had quieted into something steadier. Peace shaped by work, by loss, honored instead of feared. At the gate, she stopped, fingers brushing the metal letters she had scrubbed clean months ago. The word Forsyth gleamed faintly under the bruising sky, no longer a warning, just a name woven into history. Behind her came the sound of hoofbeats, slow, confident, Valor. He approached from the pasture, mane gilded by the last light, muscles rippling beneath a coat that had darkened into midnight silk. Each breath from his nostrils rose like smoke in the cooling air. When he reached her, he pressed his muzzle against her shoulder, the gesture deliberate and familiar. She turned slightly, resting a hand along his jawline, and smiled. "We made it," she whispered. The words trembled, but did not break. He shifted closer, ears flicking, eyes catching the reflection of the setting sun. They stood like that for a long time, woman and horse framed against the dying day, silhouettes bound by relief. The wind came gentle from the west, carrying the smell of rain on faraway soil, a ghost of that first terrible night. But it passed harmlessly now, only memory, not threat. Behind them, the ranch glowed alive, children finishing chores, porch lamps flickering on one by one. Laughter rolled across the field, unafraid of echoes. The pasture fences cast long shadows across grass that had grown green again. Even the broken corral, once a monument of disaster, had become a training ring, its boards replaced by steady hands. Clara climbed onto the lowest rung of the gate, leaning forward slightly as if she might step straight into the horizon. The hum of cicadas rose, blending with the thrumming pulse of dusk. She thought of every version of herself that had led her here, the city dreamer, the fugitive, the mourner, the stubborn caretaker. Each of them seemed to gather around her now, silent, grateful witnesses to the woman still standing. Valor nudged her again, snorting softly. She laughed under her breath, low and round, a sound that surprised her every time. "You want to go?" she teased, voice barely above a whisper, and opened the gate just wide enough for him to slip through. He trotted a few steps ahead, then turned, waiting. The light caught the healed lines along his neck, transforming scars into silver filigree. Together they began walking down the fence line, the sun sinking at their backs. Dust rose around them, glowing. Above, the first evening star blinked awake. Everything, the fields, the house, the sky, seemed to breathe in unison, one vast rhythm of endurance and renewal. The camera of memory pulled higher then, rising with the quiet exhale of twilight. From above, the ranch stretched wide and bright against the folds of the valley, fences forming perfect circles, the pond shining like a piece of captured sky. What had once been cursed shimmered now as a sanctuary of motion and warmth. The narrator's voice, Clara's quiet thought, set free, folded through the fading light. Not every curse is a punishment. Some are invitations. To begin again. Below, a woman leaned into a horse's steady grace, and the world kept turning, slow, forgiving, infinite.